this presentation, we will focus on the elements of analysis. First, we need to define what analysis is. Analysis means to break apart and examine the pieces of an item. So discussing the components and explaining the meaning to gain a better understanding of the whole work. Some ways of breaking apart, or some ways of looking at the purpose of doing analysis, is primarily to explain how or why something works in a certain way. It might be to further examine a work. Examine, for example, a symbol in a literary work. You might define it literally and what it represents, or the figurative meaning, but you would also look at how that symbol relates to the entire work as a whole. One word that you might not know is explicate. You might explicate a poem, so you might take it line by line, break the whole poem apart line by line, and look at what each of those lines state, and then look at each of those lines in relation to the rest of the work and how it breaks apart. But it also differentiates, and keep in mind that analysis does not just happen with literary works. It can happen with any discipline. You might differentiate characters in a literary work. You might differentiate certain types of diseases in order to eliminate some and be able to treat other ones if you're a nurse or a doctor. It might compare, it might contrast items, and so you break down the components to see where the similarities exist. You break down the components to see where the dissimilarities exist. Essentially what you're doing when you analyze is you're evaluating, you're investigating further. You might be agreeing or disagreeing or supporting or defending an argument or a specific point. Maybe you agree with 2 points, but you disagree with another point, and you need to lay out that argument and that logic. It might integrate. Maybe it pulls together different sources, especially opposing viewpoints, to show where the overlap is. It integrates those ideas to really dissect and see what do these different people or these different groups believe. It might form questions, not just in the paper, but form questions to get at the content of the paper. It makes you think through it. It asks why this exists, how this exists, in order to get to a deeper point. Analysis might also distinguish what is present in an argument and also point out what is missing from it that needs to be considered. But ultimately what analysis tries to do is tries to provide meaning and a deeper understanding. Through all of these dissections and all these categories and all of this fleshing out, it wants to get to a deeper meaning and understanding of what people are talking about. Analysis does break apart a concept in order to describe those parts, and it relates the parts back to the main point or concept. So in other words, if you're thinking about a paper and you have an introductory paragraph that has a very clear thesis statement, then in the body paragraphs you're dissecting parts, but you still always have your thesis statement in mind. And so it points back to that thesis statement, maybe even mentions keywords or components from that thesis to make sure that everything is connected and unified in the paper. Analysis, though, is not summarizing. It does not restate main points. That's summary's job. That is not analysis's job. So a basic differentiation between summary and analysis would be that summary is absolutely going to restate and retell main points, and it's going to be a small portion of a paper. I've seen some advice online from other instructors that say 90% of the paper needs to be analysis and only 10% of the paper can be summary. And some people would change that to maybe an 80-20 mix, 80% analysis, 20% of summary. But what you get the point is that a very little percentage of the paper should really be summary. A majority of a paper should contain analysis. And the analysis, whereas the summary restates or retells the main points, the analysis interprets those points. It shows the meaning. It breaks apart those ideas, and it shows the meaning of the main points that have already been mentioned in the summary. And again, it unifies it. It goes back to the thesis statement. It locks in that concept within that paragraph or that section of the paper, but it also makes sure that it ties that piece into the larger concept of the paper, right there in that paragraph, or maybe in a whole paragraph to itself. Let's think of some examples of where you might summarize versus analyze. In a science lab, you've completed an experiment. One of the first things that you're expected to do with the lab report is to summarize the experiment steps. What did you do? What was performed? So that recounts, right? It retells. However, you might present the results, but you're going to analyze them. Another example would be a business report. You might summarize the features of a set of products, maybe that you're wanting to compare or see which one is better than the other one. But when you get to the bulk of the paper, you're not just summarizing what those product features are, you're analyzing what they do and how effective they are and what they mean to the product overall. What advantage does this have on this product that that product doesn't have? That's what people really want to know when they go to compare the products. One more example would be a psychological study where you might summarize the behavior of the person briefly so that someone can diagnose, but you also want to analyze why the patient behaves that way. You're using that summary and those characteristics of the behavior in order to get to the analysis of it so that behavior change can happen. You wouldn't just summarize and then say, hey, change this. No, you would go through and you would analyze what that person is doing, all those behaviors together, in order to reach a conclusion about what you might change. Some classic examples of art classes would be to study a work of art. In that work of art paper, you would summarize the components. What actually does this work of art have in its representation? If you're looking at an image, what are the colors that are there? What is in the picture? Is it a landscape? Is it a portrait? What is in that image? So you might recount what the pieces are. But what you really want to do in order to get into the analysis section or the analysis concept would be to study that painting. Why did that person put that person there? Why did they use that color for that person and use a different color for this other person over here? You look at the components that they choose to include in that work of art. One that you're probably more familiar with is a movie review, where at the very beginning, people summarize the plot. They want to connect to the people who have not viewed it before and say, hey, here's what happened in this movie. However, a bulk of the actual movie review would be an analysis of that movie. So it would break apart and look at the plot and say, why was that twist in the plot strong, or why was that weak? Why did they change perspective from this character to that character? Those would be elements of analysis to get to the why. And finally, from literature, you might summarize the characters and their roles in the piece, but that would be very brief. What you want to do is look at, why did the character behave in that manner? And was that character true to either its type or to him or herself? Was there something unbelievable about that character? Or did the character go through a change that changed the flow of the plot and structure? So we're going to get to some of the questions, because one of the best things that you can do in order to help yourself analyze is to ask questions. And we're going to look at this Dorothy Parker poem. Yes, it is this brief. If you look at the upper part of the slide, the poem is called News Item, and it's written by Dorothy Parker. Men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses. Okay, those two lines are the whole poem. Now you might think, man, there's not too much to this poem. What is there to analyze? There's a lot. You get an entire paper out of sexism and studying what is she actually saying about men? What is she saying about women? What is she saying about people who wear glasses? What stereotypes is she persisting? Some of the basic questions that you might ask about any work is, what is the theme or motif of this work? In this case, a poem. What is the purpose behind it? What is the tone that the author is using? Who is his or her intended audience? But once you get past some of those basic questions, which do create a good starting point, you start seeing new, fresh questions and new, fresh material to be able to analyze. One of those concepts might be adding the layer of the title onto the poem. What new meaning is found? I mean, news item. Is she calling out to all women that you're stupid if you wear glasses because you're never going to get a man? Is it that kind of a newspaper barker kind of announcement? Or is there another message or another way that she is making a commentary to women about wearing glasses? What statement is Parker making about men? I mean, the first thing that the brain probably notices is all the sexism in that. But is she being sexist towards men? Or is she being sexist towards women? Is she showing some maturity or age preferences? Or is she saying that this is what society believes? You could examine each of those components in different paragraphs and get a lot of content out of that. One question that pops out to me immediately is, why does she use the word girls instead of women? Because she uses the word men, but she doesn't use the word boys. So what is she saying about women? That older women cannot get a man, cannot attract a man, but young women who wear glasses are especially going to make themselves look older or intelligent, and so they can't wear them if they want to get a man. these are just a few of the questions. We have so many more questions that just these 2 lines of poetry and a title can create for a reader. Now I want to show you how to pull those questions and those answers into a little bit of a template for a paragraph. Any good paragraph is not just going to include one major point. It's going to argue that point in several different ways and is going to build several sentences of content, most likely. And so you'll notice that the paragraph template that's in front of you has a transition and topic sentence. It starts out with point 1, and I've labeled all the questions or ideas in green for you on here about how you might develop that idea. You might even use a simple quote with the citation in there. And these questions, if you're answering these things about this idea, this main concept, this point 1, then you're going to have plenty of development and analysis to keep your brain going on that point. So if you have a topic sentence, you develop not just 1 point, but 2 points, and you argue in a few sentences. You might use a direct quote. How does the quote tie back to the topic sentence or the thesis or main point of the paper, and why? I mean, those are just a few ideas to get your brain going on how you might develop that analysis into a whole paragraph. And then you've got a similar concept to get going with arguing point 2. Now let's see this in action. The sample paragraph below ties into the template I just offered you. I'm going to read this paragraph aloud, and then in the next slide, we will break out and color code the topics as well as the analysis so that you can see how it ties into the template. When studying Parker's language, the reader knows she is playing off of stereotypes of males and females. Rather than using female counterpart to men, which is the word women, she uses the word girls. Choosing the word girls means that youth has an advantage in dating, and girls are asked out on a date, not older women. Pairing youth with glasses, which represent intelligence, sends a message to a young woman that she cannot be too intelligent because she will not attract a man. The direct message to girls and women becomes, old women wear glasses, not pretty young girls. And single girls who want to get married will never wear glasses to make themselves smart. Another stereotype Parker creates is that a man cannot or will not date or marry a smart woman, which creates a stereotype that men are shallow. Here is that same paragraph color-coded for our template. You can see that the first statement is the topic sentence. The second non-underlined statement is that reference back into the poem that becomes our summary. See, you don't need to mention much. You need to make a point out of what you're referring to. All of the underlined material there continues the analysis of that paragraph. There's not just 1 or 2 sentences here. There are 3 or 4 sentences that are extended and explain that one point. And then you can see that towards the end, it starts on another point within that paragraph, or maybe it's a little too much. Maybe we need to break it out into another paragraph and examine men separately. But you can see that continuation. The bulk of this paragraph contains analysis. So when constructing a paper, remember, keep summary or retelling the main points as brief as possible in your paper. It should only be a small amount. The bulk of the paper should be analysis, where you're interpreting points, breaking apart and showing meaning, and dissecting ideas, and unifying those concepts back to the main idea of the paper or of that section of the paper. A majority of the content should be analysis. To read more Dorothy Parker, get the Norton Anthology of Literature by Women, Traditions in English.